The title of my talk is Learning from Europe, what are the lessons for North American labor from European Union and co-determination experiences with Industry 4.0. Okay, so my entry point to this is I've been doing work for some time on high-performance work systems, mostly in North America, and of course this is also feeding in to some of the debates around Industry 4.0. And in doing the work on the high-performance work systems, I've become aware, obviously, for a long time about the role that co-determination and other systems play in Western Europe. And it's also because many North American progressive scholars and policymakers have stressed the need to give employees a greater voice in Industry 4.0, especially via adopting these kinds of institutional configurations around co-determination, works councils, and so forth. So Elizabeth Warren, potential presidential candidate, senator in the United States, has talked very importantly about works councils, other kind of more academic research, talking about using works councils to try to give workers more voice as they negotiate Industry 4.0. And so most recently, the head of the AFL-CIO International wing, Kathy Feingold, has said that German unions have a better position to negotiate Industry 4.0 because German law lays a foundation for the power of unions in the workplace because it conceives workers as valued participants in the workplace. Through unions and work councils, workers have an important role in shaping policies at the shop floor and management boardrooms. Okay, so the aspect here then is that there's this notion that there's this empowerment of workers through works councils, and that this is going to lead to a better status for workers in negotiating Industry 4.0. But my question is this really the case? Is this really how works councils actually are dealing with Industry 4.0 in Europe and unions and their own? In the sense we really need to actually see what's actually happening on the ground as opposed to somewhat arm's length and perhaps unrealistic expectations for what works councils can really do. So we need to examine how unions and co-determination institutions are actually bargaining in Europe around Industry 4.0, and what kinds of proposals are coming out of this for reforming or repowering or empowering works councils and co-determination institutions as a result of some of these changes. And then what are the implications of these for North American unions and workers? And this is what can we learn from Europe. Now, I have done work in Europe. Great Britain, is still sort of technically part of Europe for another few months. I've also done some work in Italy, but I'll try not to sound too much like the sort of ignorant North American protagonists in Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad, blundering through the European institutional landscape. So please forgive me if I do. I'm sure there's lots of people who have way more expertise than me on this, and they will enlighten us all. Okay, so Industry 4.0, we've already heard a lot about it. I don't want to go into a lot of detail. I will say that it's really more a kind of suite of supposedly interrelated practices, a kind of paradigm. So additive manufacturing, this notion of the integration of sensors and data across the supply chain, one-off kinds of manufacturing, as we've heard as well, all sorts of kinds of things, so from the original fabrication to ultimately recycling and so forth. From a labor point of view, there's a couple of things that are perhaps interesting in terms of potential bargaining power. One thing that's been coming out of some of the European work is that there's been a significant decline in labor costs as a proportion of total costs. So labor costs perhaps becoming less the issue in terms of siting of these kinds of manufacturing and these kinds of production practices. Some evidence of backshoring. So if you look at the German case, some of the data that's coming out is that there's less offshoring, less use of low labor costs as the reason for offshoring. It's not enormous, but it's been changing. Now that's partly because there's been a suppression of German wages as well. So there's some other things that are feeding into that. But there's this argument that's emerging in some of the literature that this is kind of perhaps an opportunity to enhance workers' bargaining power. The other aspect that comes out is that Industry 4.0 is still very inchoate. It's really kind of more of a wish list of management futures and so forth. It's often characterized by a lot of technological determinism, and it can certainly ignore the continued importance of employee involvement. But there is some people who are doing work on this, like Peter Todderdale and others, talk about unions and workers moving towards more industrial relations focuses to become a potential driver of and resource for organizational innovation as it occurs within Industry 4.0. Okay, so let's look at the North American context. As you all probably know, there's obviously a significant deficit in any kind of institutional rights for workers in North America to have what we would call, broadly speaking, a kind of co-determination voice. And this partly becomes from, there's longstanding resistance from firms, of course, but also unions in many cases have had a longstanding suspicion of getting into co-involvement. So in the auto industry, which I do a lot of work on in Canada, the Unifor and then predecessor CAW was often very suspicious of not wanting to get involved in any kind of co-management kinds of arrangements. And so Susan Helper has argued that North American firms are reluctant to give production workers more say about production decisions out of fear that workers, rather than firm owners, will capture most of the productivity gains. Okay, so there's this issue of what happens when there's more voice. And indeed, there's some evidence from Europe that the share of value that goes to workers through co-determination actually goes up compared to other workers that do not have co-determination. We also need to note, though, there's a significant labor law differences between the United States and Canada. So in the US, you can't have a works council without a union. And so some of you may remember a few years ago, VW in Chattanooga, Tennessee, was encouraging unionization through the UAW, not so much because they wanted unionization, but they actually wanted to have a works council. And what was interesting in there was the state of Tennessee mobilized all its resources to prevent both unionization and works councils, and that vote went down to defeat. In Canada, union presence is not necessary. So, for example, in some cases, unions, for example, in the deal, the Framework for Fairness between Magna and CAW in 2007, there wasn't necessarily a stipulation to have a union present in that kind of deal, right? So in Canada, there's often been a long history of establishment-level health and safety committees, and the previous government in Ontario actually thought about maybe upgrading those to discuss all employment issues. Obviously, it's sort of a dead letter right now under the Ford government in Ontario. But also in the post-2008-09 crisis, union representatives are now a board of directors in GM, Fiat Chrysler in the United States. There's also been evidence of increasing cooperation between unions and management over high-performance work systems. So I know Joel's done some work on this and some others. Some work I'm also doing with Lorenzo Frangi in Ontario. We're seeing that there's a lot of cooperation going on in actually adopting high-performance work systems. However, we need to put an important caveat on this, is that this representation is at best contractual and it's often informal. There's no legal compulsion for firms to have any kind of arrangement. And indeed, as we see, unions themselves are not really sure that in all cases that they want to have that. And also, if you look in Ontario right now, a lot of discussion about Industry 4.0. The mainstream policy view is that unions are kind of, okay, well, it's too bad they're there anyway in the first place, but their role is just to be good followers of this process and hold down labor costs. There's no sense in which there's any kind of active role that unions may or may not play in any kind of transition. Okay, so I'm going to give you Nadi's guide to unions and co-determination in Europe, as many of you already know about this, but co-determination cornerstones include, of course, statutory works councils and employee and union board level representation. There's significant variation, of course, in how these particular institutions are constituted at the national scale, and they're mostly national institutions and who have been built up through the European work councils as well. That's another layer. So in Italy, for example, they don't actually have any formally mandated works councils, but through the unions, they do have a kind of quasi-co-determination kind of system that works out. And of course, we now, in the last 20 years or so, have had this layer of European works councils. Okay. So the research shows that there's actually important positive synergies on the whole between unions and co-determination institutions. They've had a pretty significant positive impact in raising employee and share of value, some influence over firm outsourcing and offshoring strategies. Employee representatives at the company board tend to contribute to a more broadly based corporate strategy by ensuring that it takes into account early stage the views and interests of workers. And then also research is showing that with flexicurity systems, especially in Nordic countries in this co-determination, that Swedish workers, for example, are overwhelmingly positive for what it means in terms of their view of technological change, whereas the most recent surveys of American workers say that 72% are very apprehensive, if not negative, about this because they feel they have little or no control over where that system is going. So let's look at what unions are actually doing. And this is, again, hardly a thorough survey. It's a very selective one and based on English language literature that's out there. So we look at Germany, we look at Italy. Unions overall are trying to push firms away from this kind of just simply to automate things to try to get a more specialized model that upgrades workers' skills. In Italy, we have this kind of notion of a more professionalized worker with rights to continuing re-education, requalification, which was recognized in the 2016 National Collective Agreement. Smart working strategies to limit extending working hours. So we know already from the presentations that this can be a significant issue. In IG Metall, there's again this notion of reintegrating or integrating worker requalification into the firm's longer-term technical strategies. So trade unions are there not only to manage work conflicts, but to suggest credible solutions to management over where these systems are going. So Venezuela has talked about IG Metall's strategy to intervene as early as possible in Industry 4.0, especially working very, very closely with the works councils, who are kind of the first line of representation in this. And then we've also seen initiatives to extend works councils to so-called platform workers, such as app-based Austrian food delivery workers. Okay, so however, there are major challenges. Unions, on the one hand, are being propelled, as well as co-determination institutions, into greater involvement in technological and strategic issues. And what we are seeing is that unions and these institutions are showing some resiliency and robustness, and there's some experimentation going on. But we also need to realize that there's certain limits to co-determination and what unions can actually do in the European context. And that these are partly due to the institutional infrastructure, how they're designed in the first place. So there's actually, quite a few limits on their ability to intervene in terms of strategic technological development. And this was noted as far back as in the mid-1980s by Fricka, especially when we have these blurring and extensions of the workplace more generally associated with this technology. And as Muller-Jensch has pointed out, that the potential for works councils' intervention in managerial decisions decreases with proximity to essential business decisions, in the sense that the more strategic the decisions that are being made, the less influence unions and work councils actually have. Similarly, in Denmark, one study, a fairly extensive study of works councils, said that if you look at work organization and new technology, thank you, there's basically these decisions workers don't really offer any actual influence, let alone co-determination on decisions regarding these issues. So in some cases, it's hard to know whether workers there actually have any more right than some unions who have, in their contracts here, have negotiated, for example, early warning on technological change, which, for example, Unifor has done. Also, there's a whole remit of other changes that have gone on, the hollowing out of co-determination in some cases, increasing core periphery and workforces, tensions between unions and work councils, especially if you look at Germany, and also overall declining coverage. There's also a lot of criticism, or a lot of noting at least, that 30, 40 years ago, German, Swedish, and Danish unions were really interested in coming up with bona fide alternatives through using socio-technical systems during the 1980s, and that has really faded in many cases. So their ability to really even conceptualize big alternatives has actually been diminished according to some of this literature. Similarly, there's marginalization and incorporation risks for labor representatives. So in Sweden, labor board members are generally focusing on production decisions, but as Movitz and Levinson say, this might be a dangerous strategy because the local organization of production is increasingly determined by market contacts between companies and investors, rather than through employment contracts between employees and employers. So what should be done? And again, I'm just surveying a lot of the literature. One, there's a lot of criticism of universal basic income as a potential strategy. It's seen as quite flawed. So for example, the head of the German Federation of Trade Unions has called universal basic income a complete disorientation. And also there's been criticism of just simply increasing training and so forth. If you look at the Danish flexicurity system, there's increasing critiques that it's becoming effectively a more neoliberal work-first model, not a human capital first model, which is what often it's portrayed as being. But really the problem with a lot of these other strategies is they're simply reactive. They don't really deal with who decides about technology and work organization. And so what we're seeing is a host of proposals to more fully empower and democratize co-determination institutions, develop their technical and socio-political capabilities of both the members and so forth like that, and increasing the balance of power for employees vis-a-vis management, to revive these earlier socio-technical system experiments that unions had been involved with in order to give a more impetus to actually changing the nature of work. And also to more fully recognize the increased diversity of the workforce and how work and technological design and voice institutions need to be made more inclusionary, and also how to extend current attempts to reduce working hours, which are, thank you, are linked to wider social reproduction issues. So Durer, for example, has talked about the 28-hour work week when by IG Metall is linked in many cases to family life, to other social reproduction issues, not just simply what's going on in the workplace. Okay, more out of the box is this, some of the stuff we're seeing from Britain and the British Labour Party, which in a way is kind of going back to the future, back to the 70s, trying to think about perhaps using the old Swedish minor wage earner funds to extend worker ownership and control through the inclusive ownership fund. And the argument here is that because all of this is going to be associated with a huge pushback from capital, firms will not probably voluntarily want to embrace any of these kinds of things, that this really has to be part of capturing a political agenda. So, Lawrence talks about the Inclusive Ownership Fund as being equivalent of Thatcher's right to buy policy. The way her right to buy policy of public housing was a kind of thing that captured the working class in the 80s. We recaptured the working class through the economic democracy. And so then finally, in the Italian case, there's this notion that Gatti et al. Talk about. We need to really make a distinction between the design of computer artifacts to avoid de-skilling and designing for democracy at work, that is to change the power relationships at work in favor of employees, which means the need to acquire collective control over the processes of technological change. Okay, so I finally want to conclude with what do we take away from this from our North American perspective. So on the one hand, the European experience is both confirmation that there is some bona fide role, positive role that unions and co-determination are playing, but it's also a cautionary tale. We don't want to exaggerate what those powers are or what the real challenges that confront unions and Industry 4.0. But what we can say is that, first of all, managerial strategies towards Industry 4.0 are still really uncertain and are taking shape. So they're open in some cases. It's not a predetermined path that they're going to take. As far if unions in North America really want to have, or workers really want to have, and the surveys show that most workers in the United States want some kind of elected representation at work. If unions want that and workers want that, what would it look like? What should they do? Imagine a world where that could actually happen here in North America. Basically what we find from the European case is that works councils work best when supported by strong unions, that there's a potential for very strong synergies here. But when advocating for co-determination, workers and unions must go beyond point of production and establishment scale representation and aim to win full co-determination rights over firm technological and financial strategies. That is, they should not just simply be looking at establishment level issues, and to connect workers' concerns regarding Industry 4.0 over the sphere of social reproduction. They also are going to need to put resources into developing stronger technical capabilities. And again, this is, unions have a lot of demands on their resources right now. Is that something that they're going to be prepared to do? That's an open question. And then finally, we have to view these demands for co-determination as a political strategy, not just a technical adjustment to helping out Industry 4.0, but rather a broader political issue. Okay, thank you.